Hello, my name is Kevin Vigil, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Playing the Guitar with Your Brain. The topic for this segment is the motor system, how we move. Once, I attended a body mapping seminar by my friend Gerald Harsher. He opened with a question: what do musicians do for a living? His answer was that musicians move for a living. Well, think about that. Whether you make a living or not with music is irrelevant to this discussion, but musicians certainly move. Gerald continued by stating that these movements are often refined, precise, and rapid. So what does that mean when it comes to the brain? Well, let's start with the primary motor cortex, which is area 4 in the Brodmann map, which is located in the frontal lobe at the central sulcus of Rolando. This is the area responsible for the initiation of a motor movement. As musicians, we're required to move in very refined and precise manners. Fortunately, the motor cortex helps to facilitate these movements. This image is called a homunculus. It represents a map of the primary motor cortex. This would be a slice through area 4. The medial view is on the left side of this illustration, and the lateral view goes around the right of the cortex. The images that surround the cortex represent specific parts of the body that are controlled by the associated points along the cortex. Notice the seemingly disproportionate amount of cortex that is used for various motor functions. That being said, it does make sense. More of the cortex is used for fine motor areas involved with the hands, the fingers, mouth, tongue. All of these require much more refinement for a particular function. In Chapter 2, I mentioned that it's important to keep in mind that no particular ability exists in a vacuum. Such is the case with the motor system. Before initiating a movement from area 4, the movement must be planned. Planning takes place in the premotor cortex, area 6, which is adjacent to area 4. But in order for the movement to be planned, sensory and somatosensory areas are also engaged in the planning process. For example, if I were attending a performance of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, which includes the use of cannon fire, I'd want to turn my head and perhaps my body to see where the sound's coming from. This would engage my auditory, visual, and the somatosensory systems, not to mention areas of the brain associated with my emotional response to the music. While planning and initiation of movement are part of the process, there is much more to this extremely complex system. So now, let's take our attention to the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum, which is located at the back of the head. While the human brain contains 100 billion neurons, 50 to 70% of those neurons are located here in the cerebellum. Furthermore, the surface area of the cerebellum is about 75% of that of the cerebral cortex. Look at this image. This is a slice through the cerebellum. Like the cerebral cortex, there are deep fissures that define lobes, which have also been mapped by neuroscientists. Although we will not define these lobes and their functions specifically, we will discuss how the cerebellum affects us as musicians. The cerebellum plays a critical role in the coordination of motor movement. Of interest to this discussion are the maintenance of equilibrium and posture, learned skilled motor movement, the timing and force of a movement, and the correction of error during an ongoing movement. In order for the cerebellum to coordinate movements, it must receive input from the primary motor cortex, the sensory systems, which includes somatosensory, as well as many nuclei of the indirect cortical-spinal and extrapyramidal systems. So, let's say that I want to point to area 17 on my brain model. As you may recall, area 17 is the primary visual cortex located in the occipital lobe. I will first look at where I want to point. Using my proprioception, or the knowledge of where my limbs are, I will move toward the model and touch area 17. Now, without the cerebellum, I wouldn't be able to correct my ongoing movements or control the amount of force that I wanted to apply when touching the model. By now, you can imagine the importance of the cerebellum when it comes to playing an instrument. When we position the guitar, our posture is extremely important. Learned skilled motor movements are physical abilities that we've developed with practice. Timing and force of movement have a direct implication for playing in rhythm, our technique, and dynamics. Our motor system plays a role in many other activities that we do, such as the subconscious habit of swinging our arms while walking. One ability, however, that should not be overlooked by a musician is the ability to maintain the appropriate background tone in the muscles of the body. Think about it. If I want to make a quick, repetitive motion by my wrist, my elbow needs to be stable. And if I want to make quick, repetitive motions in my fingers, my wrist must be stable. The appropriate background muscle tone is important in order to move with the specificity that we require as musicians. Now, even though the topic of this discussion has been on the motor system, we had to include other systems in order to plan movement. What we do as musicians actually makes changes in our brains. I'd like to share with you the findings of research conducted in 2003 that was published in the Journal of Neuroscience. The title of this article is "Brain Structures Differ Between Musicians and Non-Musicians." Listen as I read this abstract. Using a voxel by voxel morphometric technique, we found gray matter volume differences in motor, auditory, and visual spatial brain regions when comparing professional musicians, keyboard players, with a matched group of amateur musicians and non-musicians. Although some of these multi-regional differences could be attributed to innate predisposition, we believe that they may represent structural adaptations in response to long-term skill acquisition and the repetitive rehearsal of those skills. These images were published with the article. The yellow areas represent the amateur musician's increase in gray matter volume, and the red areas represent the professional musicians. Continue to look at these images as I read from the results of the study. In comparing these three groups, professional musicians, amateur musicians, and non-musicians, areas with a significant positive correlation between musician status and increase in gray matter volume were found in peri-Rolandic regions, including primary motor and somatosensory areas, premotor areas, anterior superior parietal areas, and in the inferior temporal gyrus bilaterally. A positive correlation means that the gray matter volume is higher in professional musicians, intermediate in amateur musicians, and lowest in non-musicians. Additional positive correlations with musician status were seen in the left cerebellum, left Herschel's gyrus, and left inferior frontal gyrus. Well, if that doesn't inspire you to practice, what will? So let's come back to Gerald's question. Just what is it that musicians do? We move. Thank you for watching, and happy practicing.